Chapter 343, 19 begins. Tuesday, September 3, 19,961,241. Z10 250 Lecture Hall, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Cambridge. United States of America. Jill came into the lecture hall early, hoping that she would get a seat. Unfortunately, that was not the case. Every single chair was taken in the lecture hall, and people were already talking about the possibility of moving it to the even larger 26-100. It looked like a lot of the students were freshmen, which made sense as 19 was a hasty. However, the fact that upperclassmen like herself were thinking of taking this course, even though they had fulfilled all of their humanities requirements, testified to the great interest in the new department. A good half of the upperclassmen knew the teacher from her days as a student in Russian House, at least by sight. Jill actually knew her a little better through several mutual friends who were involved with Kurchatova's social circles and former sorority. Several of these friends had reported that Kurchatova had been prepping frantically for the new course over the past couple of days, editing the syllabus over and over again. Magic could only get you so far, she thought. Kurchatova's social circles had gone bonkers when she had come out as a witch. Although several of the more conservative members had stopped talking to her, the vast majority of Kurchatova's friends had been supportive and had for the most part been mature enough to not ask her to concoct love potions for them. She looked around the room and saw the vast majority of Kurchatova's friends here. Several members of her sorority were here, as was a good two-thirds of Russian House. There were even a few people from the classes of 1994 and 1995 who had stopped by to see the young witch in action. She took a look at the syllabus. It looked like a typical humanities course in that it was primarily reading. However, there were a few differences in that many of the teaching assistants were witches and or of a different species. 1900 Introduction to Magic, Fall 1996 TR9, 00-10, 30, 10-50. Primary Lecturer, Ms. Jelena J. Kurchatova J. Kircher at MIT, Edu. Alternate Lecture Rooms, Guinevere de Mornay, Salem Witches Institute 89. Teaching Assistants, Terry Powers, Quabbin Academy of Sorcery 93 MS. Lisette Cabin, SWY 91, Vila * Doctor. Keith Reeder, Cass 81, PhD MR. Tyler Tidwell, Smoky Mountain Wizarding School 92 Mr. Goldbrick, Goblinums. Susan Riles, SWY 90 Mrs. Sierra Centaur. Course Objective S. This course is designed to introduce Muggle, that is, non-wizarding students to magic, its history, and what it can and cannot do. There will be a brief discussion of wizarding culture and the world, which had been long hidden by the statute of secrecy. Most of the coursework will consist of reading assignments and discussions in recitations. There will be, on average, a good 100-150 pages of reading per week, sometimes in the unusual dialect of English known as Gulliver. Depending on which aspects of the wizarding world are exposed during the semester, the course may be changed to include different readings. There will be 4 papers during the course of the semester, each counting for 10% of your final grade. The midterm will be 20%, and the final will be 30%. The remaining 10% will be dedicated to independent research on the wizarding world, which students will be expected to perform outside of class and will be able to consult the teaching assistants at any time. The following books will all be available at the MIT Coop, thanks to a generous donation by the American Department of Magic. Adventures with Arachnids, Lockhart, 1983, The Tales of Beedle the Bard, Unknown Wizarding for Dummies, Various Muggle Presses, 1996, Magical Theory, Konitz, 1992, A History of the Magical World, Upton, 1986, Reflections on Judgment Day, Dialanis, 1996, Noah, Utnapishtim and the Hammer of Ra, Dialanis, 1996. Note that this recitation section is available only to women and will be held at Wellesley College. Mrs. Sierra is not originally from Houyhnhnmland and hopes to take this opportunity to show the world that centaurs and humans can coexist peacefully. She, like the rest of us, is horrified at what has happened in her homeland and is praying fervently for peace. Jill put down the syllabus, impressed. It looked like a pretty substantial course, and judging by all the books on the list, it would have a lot of reading. Granted, from what she had been told, the Lockhart book was essentially a first-person fantasy novel written by a wizard. The only thing missing from the course at the moment was the professor. Checking her watch, she noticed that it was 8:59. The excitement was building, though there was an undercurrent of worry as well. Had something gone wrong? Had Kurchatova realized that it would be almost impossible to handle that flying carpet business, her regular grad school studies, and 19 at the same time? Jill knew the truth, however. One of Kurchatova's friends had tipped her off. Grinning, she smiled at all of the students glancing towards the blackboards and the main entrance, and then craned her head to look up. The clock hit 9:00, and less than a second later, a flash of light startled everyone in the room. When it had cleared, a huge flying carpet was hovering in the front of the room, above the blackboards and the desk. The lecture hall took up most of 3 floors, with the chairs rising up from the entrance hall like banks of seats at Fenway Park. The carpet had appeared level with the topmost row of seats, near the ceiling, and a good 30 feet or so above the place where Kurchatova would give her lecture. The crowd cheered as the carpet circled the room and touched down in the front of the room next to the desk. It was carrying 9 passengers. Jill recognized Jelena and Guinevere immediately, as did everyone else. One of them seemed to be very short and reminded Jill of Thomas from the initial eye-entry tour. He had to be the goblin. The centaur was obvious as she had 4 legs and 2 ponytails, one on her rear end and one on her head. The rest of the Tars seemed like ordinary people as far as she could tell. There were a few guys and a few girls. She wondered if the Vila was there. She had to be all the people listed on the syllabus were there, if the Vila was there. She didn't need to look far to determine if the Vila was there. The 3 boys in her row had their eyes open large enough to fit bowling balls. One of them was actually sighing uncontrollably, and one was drooling. There was a thud as one of the people in the back row fell onto the person in front of him. Kurchatova chuckled and turned to a woman wearing an amused smirk on her face. "That's enough, Lisette. I'll talk to you later." Lisette looked around the room and chuckled. "Hey, I should have gone here instead of the Swy." Kurchatova winced. "Don't egg them on, Lisette. Get ready for your recitation session, and remember that if there are any horny boys, send them to Sierra." Lisette looked longingly at the crowd, where many men were starting to whoop it up. "But—" Kurchatova put her hands on her head. "Number night. None. You're supposed to be helping me teach the course, not pick up guys. All right, you've gotten your practical joke out of the way. Get out of here and head over to Pomeroy Hall at Wellesley." Grimacing, the Vila grunted and vanished. Seconds later, every single boy in the room blinked as if he had come out of a trance. Kurchatova walked to the podium and stood there motionless for a few seconds. Jill read the expression on her face quite plainly, shock and stage fright. One of the Tars started walking over to help, but she quickly shook him off and began the lecture. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to 19. I'm Jelena Kurchatova, trained witch, current MIT graduate student, and graduate residence tutor of Russian House. The world has changed forever, and there is no way the magical and Muggle worlds will be able to isolate themselves again. It is my duty as an MIT student and practicing witch to prepare future generations of geeky wizards and Muggles to work, live, and play together. I know you've read about us all the time. We are not, however, like the books in the fantasy section of Barnes and Noble. We cannot raise the dead. We cannot travel faster than light. If you want fantasy, stay with the books. If you want reality, listen to me." With those words, Course 19 was reintroduced at MIT, Hinham Hamland. After the brief Portkey grenade bombardment on Saturday, the Yahoo Rebellion's forces, led by the Marquesas garrison's French commanding officer, hastily began to fortify the capital. Apparently, Hinhinham was not the only city the old government's forces seeked other. Smaller but strategically important settlements in the lowlands were also subjected to similar bombardment. At this point, the rebels had some difficult decisions to make. Even with the 50 wizards sent forward by the centaur Lord Garhim, leader of their incoming southern reinforcements, their forces were insufficient to protect all of their territories. 2 days of debating strategies, and many exhausted messenger birds later, the plan was ready. The main human rebel army would retreat to Hinhinham and fortify, occupied, or liberated, depending on who you ask. Lands east of the capital and north of the river Vashoth were to be evacuated, their human and friendly centaur populations relocated to towns in the west and into the capital itself. The army besieging the citadel of Kinnaraz was to leave behind a skeleton crew to guard the so far impregnable mountain stronghold looming over the charred remains of the west regional capital, and march on the high road back towards the capital. They would arrive in a week. 2 days after the South's main forces, they would be the reserve force of the reserve force. To complicate matters, anti-Portkey wards of any significant effect were notoriously difficult spells, so teaching them properly to the experimental half-wizards was out of the question. They wouldn't have had time for that anyway. The few dozen of them that had access to salvaged wands were taking turns casting Geminio on anything from ammo to food and medicines, and the wandless, runic alternatives required great precision and insight, and rare spell components, none of which were available now. Also, the number of available tutors drastically diminished, as real, experienced wizards were called back for more urgent duties. On the other hand, this had a very neat side effect. Instead of a few large Portkey barriers shielding whole regions, dozens of smaller barriers were conjured, each protecting a town or a district of a bigger city. This way, the enemy could not resume the bombardment by just walking over the barrier on foot. In the end, this meant that fortifying the city was very much the same as in the Muggle world. Trenches were shoveled, sandbag walls, machine gun nests and barricades were erected, and supplies were stacked up in sheltered cellars. There was no heavy artillery on the continent, nor designated anti-aircraft cannons, but they solved these more or less successfully by massing conventional firepower. And as long as the enemy didn't possess such strike capacities either, it worked. The barrier spells preventing apparition and Portkey meant they could not rely on instant magical reinforcements or resupply. This was all fine for the French officers, as long as the same restrictions were applied to the enemy. At least this way, they could command their battles in the way they were taught to, without nasty surprises. It is said that no plan survives contact with the enemy. Knowing this, Lt. Carl Marcel Lebrun was only slightly surprised when rocket-like explosives began raining down on the city, arching with physics-defying grace from beyond the mountains in the east, some dozens of miles away. As the first projectiles hit their mark, the earth began rumbling unnervingly. He found it a bit odd, as the explosions were by several orders of magnitude smaller than anything that would warrant this. Summit of Mt. Rack, 40 miles east of Hinhinham. Thiago remained impassive as he passed the omniculars to Governors Teoshin of the north and Kragach of the east. The former was apparently shocked by the sight of the capital's bombardment by their inventions, but the latter was visibly satisfied with the sight of mud, rubble, and fire erupting into the skies with every impact of the magical missiles, murmuring, "Yes, yes, Merwizard, burn them all." This confirmed his previous informations. Something was amiss in the head of the governor of Chiron's Landing. The Ciudadani standing besides them took over and whistled, one battle mage approving of another's work. Another salvo of the weapons flew overhead, their warping contrail-like traces only visible to his magical sight. The missiles were a Cusius design. Large trees were felled, their woods usually used for crafting brooms. Instead, they were hollowed out, like giant wands, and filled with the deadliest core imaginable. Tons of Muggle-made explosives, enhanced with other deadly surprises, like explosive gases, ook. Thermobaric and fuel-air explosives have been used in guerrilla warfare since 1983, requiring only propane, butane, or acetylene or napalm. Then the filled wands were enchanted to fly like brooms, in one easy but breathtaking arc at their master's command. Of course, these missiles were far from perfect. Up to this point, he observed a good 60% rate of successful explosion upon impact, and he had enough first-hand experience with explosives to know, even in those bombs, only part of the payload exploded at once. But it didn't matter. In the last few days, these devices, nicknamed the Wands of Destruction, were made by the hundreds, even thousands, tying down most of the Trapanandan forces. Now, the tree trunks, thinned down to shatter upon impact as soon as the strengthening runes in the front touched Earth, were powered up by the merwizards who did recon and strafing runs over Hinhinham in the last week. Checking their targets on the maps one last time, they concentrated on their target locations and the trajectory leading there, touched their wands to the hovering tree trunks, and whoosh, another salvo was sent off from behind the mountain. Suddenly, the ground began shaking. Confused, Thiago lost his footing, just like the one standing near him. Lying on the ground, he pressed his ear to the stone and heard a cracking, grating sound that sent shivers up his spine. He knew this sound. He heard it when the earth rumbled and shook back in the Andes when earthquakes started. Landslides. Whipping out his wand, he sprung up and took to his broom, flying over the launch site that suddenly fell silent. Silent was a strange word in context. It stood for not launching wands of destruction, not for not screaming in shocked horror. The mountain side, beginning from the summit, swayed, trees twisted as roots tried to keep the rocks together, ultimately in vain. As the gigantic avalanche started rolling towards the launch site, the merwizard officer snapped out of his shock. Thinking quickly, he casted Sonorous and yelled at his troops. All of you, on your brooms, and fly the hell out of here. Primary evacuation locations, now. In the end, when the landslide reached the missiles 30 seconds later, setting off an impact rune and causing a chain reaction of fiery hell clearly visible from the city, only a handful of unfortunate merwizards were caught in the blast, with a few dozen others suffering serious burns and other injuries. The majority of them, along with the governors, managed to get far away enough that their shields could take the worst of the shockwaves and fireballs. But getting off without major loss of life was an illusion. Now, their main weapons were lost for the time being, giving the enemy plenty of time to ready its defenses. In the end, this accident would claim much more lives and influence the outcome of this civil war. Chapter 344. Anyone here speak xylophone? Tuesday, September 3, 19,961,400, United Nations, Building Geneva, Switzerland. Anastasios Dialanis looked hard at Andrea Marcali. You're sure you want to do this, Madame President? Once you do this, there's no turning back. And if they discover that men aren't allowed to hold office in your nation, you can get into big trouble for it. Marcali shrugged. I doubt that it's going to be a problem, Ambassador. It's not like we're going to take the Protector down. After seeing what happened to the environment after those idiots in the Pacific pulled that surprise on the Centaurs, we're going to be very careful. You're not going to take down the Protector. Then how? Marcali winked at him and said, You'll find out. I've made arrangements. Dialanis suddenly found her very attractive. He was barely able to restrain himself from trying to give her a kiss after that wink. Gritting his teeth, he told her to not play around with her charming ability. Marcali slapped the palm of her hand against her head. I thought most of that had worn off. After all, I'm 66. You don't look like it, Madame President. Marcali grunted. I don't see how you humans manage it. All right, let's make the announcement. What prompted this all of a sudden? Marcali chuckled. It's mating season down there in one of the big towns. They're sick of the guys they normally fool around with, and they're worried about inbreeding. They really want to have some visitors. Considering they helped me win re-election last time, I figured I should help them out. Dionysus nearly choked. Madame President, this is not a very good idea. Makali cut him off. Just do it. Trust me, this will work. Grumbling, Dionysus strode to the podium and faced the crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure to announce the president of a nation that very few of you, if any, have heard of before, the Republic of Nestor. There were a few seconds of silence, followed by some excited murmuring. Dionysus saw that people were asking each other if they knew about Nestor. Someone mentioned that Nestor had been a character in Iliad, but that didn't do much good. What a surprise, no one knew. Dionysus explained, "There is a very good reason that you don't know about this nation. It's another hidden nation, this time in the eastern Atlantic. It is the home of the humanoid creatures known as Vila, which normally take the form of, well, extremely seductive women." Several of the men started talking to each other. Dionysus let them chew on that for a moment before adding an offhand comment. Who can turn into vicious flying monsters when they get ticked off or touched in places they don't like? The side conversation stopped as Dionysus relinquished the podium. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome President Andrea Markali of Nestor. Markali came up to the podium and posed for some Muggle photographs. The representatives of Sweden and Djibouti promptly started ogling her from the back of the room, prompting her to glare at them and raise her hands into the air, curling the fingers so they looked like claws. The two diplomats changed their demeanor very quickly. She began to speak. Ladies and gentlemen, the time has come to reveal my nation to the world. Our homeland is off the coast of Africa in the Atlantic. Although most of my species live there, there are groups of Vila scattered all around the world. For the most part, Nestor has kept to itself for the past few centuries. That has not always been the case, however. If you know of any legends about the islands of the Amazons, those are most likely derived from accidental visits to Nestor. We're Homo sapiens, just like you are, and have given ourselves the scientific designation Homo sapiens nestori. About 1 in every 10,000 of us have the ability to become wizards, just like you. This likely means that the Q and Z genes have the same frequency with us as they do with you. We can breed with humans. We are as intelligent as humans, and we have a stable civilization like yours. There are several differences, however. First, there is no such thing as a male Vila as those die in utero. It is possible, however, for a woman who is half Vila to marry another Homo sapiens and bear a male child. People who are more than 1/8 Vila may have the ability to turn into harpies, the dangerous flying creature Ambassador Dionysus mentioned earlier. Approximately 20% of female Vila and 1% of male Vila descendants have this ability. Another major difference is that there is very little marriage on the island. Although couples do exist and are protected by law, people tend to like to play the field a lot down there. Given the seduction issues, people can understand why. The most famous attribute associated with Vila is extreme beauty, few signs of aging, and the ability of people who are more than 1/8 Vila to charm people of the opposite gender. I saw that some of you were intrigued when you first saw me. I may look like I'm in my mid-30s, but I'm actually 66. If you think that I am attractive, imagine Vila in their 20s and 30s. Judging from the reactions of the men in the room, several people were fantasizing about that. She continued, a large number of supermodels and niche actresses are actually part Vila. I cannot say who without their permission, however. Some of them may not realize they are in fact partially Vila. Due to the fact that there are no full male Vila, Nestor is primarily female. To prevent complications from the seduction charm, members of the government must be at least 50 years of age, and ambassadors must be at least 60. Half Vila between the ages 17 and 35 are not permitted to leave the island without government approval and at least 2 chaperones. Rest assured that if some of these women got loose among the Muggles, people would find it hard to do any work. Full Vila are under even more restrictions, having to stay on the island until age 45. Each town has a brief mating season where the people are allowed to increase the population. Mating activity is forbidden the rest of the season on penalty of death. This is because with all of the young women around down there, no one would be able to get any work done if it were open season 365 days a year. The crowd chuckled as Markali looked over the crowd. Now let's get to some of the logistics. Unlike Howie and Himland, we are not going to be removing our protector. We had considered it, but after seeing what happened to the centaurs and to the environment after the Howiehangham protector went down, we decided against it. If Muggles want to visit Nestor, they have to visit one of our new embassies in the Canary Islands or Cape Verde. We will be running shuttles from there. At most 5,000 Muggles will be permitted on the island at any one time. Markali hesitated for a moment, but she eventually drew a deep breath and continued. You may ask what prompted us to come out at this moment. The simple truth is that we're starting to have some inbreeding issues and need to expand the gene pool. With so few men living on the island and limited interaction in the rest of the world, due to the statute of secrecy, there isn't much to pick from. The representatives started talking among themselves excitedly, and Dialanis had this horrifying vision of Nestor becoming the world's biggest spring break destination. He fervently hoped Markali knew what she was doing public school too, Xylixilenda next up. Stick to making Lucky Charms, it's a good thing they let me go on this trip, Megan Baldwin thought. Otherwise, they would have likely been completely up the creek. Hidden under the invisibility cloak, she watched as the teenagers played Quidditch in the schoolyard. Having never seen the sport, the first anthropologist to visit the school had no idea what they were doing. He had originally thought it was some kind of hazing or religious ritual where kids threw balls at each other. The school seemed to have two divisions when it came to Quidditch, one for ages 11-13 and one for ages 14-17. She suspected that it was because the older students were much stronger than the younger ones and had a tendency to shove the first years off their brooms. In addition, it looked like the students were strapped to their brooms as well to make sure they didn't fall off. Megan found that most fascinating and made a mental note to tell Dumbledore about this when she came back for the 1997-1998 school year. The score was 50-50 when the principal called everyone in from recess. The kids grumbled a little, but they packed up the Quidditch equipment and walked back into the building. Megan followed them in, invisible. The halls looked strange without lockers. The replacement for lockers became obvious when one of the children toting the bludgers touched her wand to the wall and drew an intricate symbol. The wall disappeared and revealed what were obviously the contents of a traditional school locker: books, lunch containers, and so forth. The girl shoved the Quidditch equipment in and headed back to class. She walked down the hallway and stopped when she saw a class schedule for one of the school years. It looked similar to that of Hogwarts, but not quite. Monday 800-8, 50 Muggle Studies 900-9, 50 Gulliver 10-00-10, 50 Astrology 11-00-11, 50 Math 1-00-1, 50 Russian 2-00-2, 50 Potions 3-00-3, 50 History 4, 10-5, 00 Wandbook 5, 10-6, 00 Inuit Literature. She jotted down the schedule in amazement. It looked like all of these students were doing a double curriculum, with both magical coursework and traditional courses like math, history, and so forth. She had a strong suspicion that the Xyland School Board had been busy during the summer. The Inuit literature and Russian threw her for a moment before it finally occurred to her why they had been included. Xylenda was in the Pacific, due south of the Bering Strait. What this meant was that the most common Muggle languages Xyland would encounter would be English, which presumably they used Gulliver for, Inuit, the traditional trading partner, and Russian. Officially, the Muggle researchers called the Xyland language Gulliver. Unofficially, however, they were calling it xylophone. It made sense, after all. An Anglophone country spoke English. What type of language would be spoken in Xylenda? She continued down the hallway and saw one of the children lugging around a basketball. Judging by the fact that the kid had a large following despite the acne on his face, it seemed that the fans were more interested in the basketball than the kid himself. One of the other kids promptly tried to take the ball, at which point the child who had brought in the prized Muggle relic threw it at his head. He missed, and the ball promptly started bouncing down the hall. The kids looked around at each other for a second. Megan could see the gears churning in those young minds. Finally, one of the kids came out with it. Pointing at the ball, which was now in one girl's arms, he said, "Forsooth, 'tis Muggle bludger. I dinna ken Muggles had bludgers. They are more akin to us than we thought." That, of course, proved to be a mistake, as the kids started trying to pelt each other with the ball. Inevitably, the teachers stumbled into the fight and confiscated the valuable Muggle artifact. The kids complained, of course, but they inevitably returned to class. Megan imagined that they didn't want detention when their school day got out at 6 p.m. The teacher who had eventually wound up with the ball looked at it thoughtfully for a few seconds. Glancing at the schoolyard, he got up and started walking towards the Quidditch pitch. He chuckled for a moment and told the man next to him, "I have an idea. Ensure the students dinna see me." Megan followed the teacher outside, where he walked over to the playground, rummaged in a storage cabinet, and brought out an extra Quidditch scoring ring along with its post. The posts were made out of 10-foot increments, as the 3 rings were 30, 40, and 50 feet in height. He took a look at the ball, brought out his wand, and shrank the ring somewhat. He then took out one of the 10-foot pole pieces, attached the shrunken ring to the top, and jammed it into the ground at one end of the playground. Nodding at it in approval, he picked up the Muggle ball and tried to throw it into the circle 10 feet above the ground. He eventually succeeded. After a few tries, it was harder than it looked. Each time it went through the circle, the home side of the magical scoreboard incremented by 10 points. "'Tis very interesting." He then walked over to the contraption and then bent the scoring ring 90 degrees so that the top was parallel to the top of the pole. He tossed the ball in a few more times, making sure that it was still possible to get the ball through the hoop. Finally, he Geminia'd the entire contraption and placed the second copy at the other end of the Quidditch pitch. He tossed the ball through, and the guest side of the scoreboard incremented by 10 points. He returned to the center of the arena, bounced the ball around, and looked at his handiwork. Very interesting indeed. 2 points for the 10-foot ring, 6 for the 30, 8 for the 40, and 10 for the 50. Aye, and no brooms. Megan stared at the teacher in amazement. Had he just introduced basketball to the world of Quidditch, or Quidditch to the world of basketball? Juneau, Alaska. Zoli, the witch couldn't pass up something like this. The big sign on top of the building said Independence Day 4, 38:30. She figured this had to be a cultural reference, possibly a museum. This would be a good chance to learn about the United States' history. Wrapping her broom in the invisibility cloak and hoping that she would be able to speak Muggle English, she headed over to the woman in the little booth. "I'd like to see Independence Day, please." "Certainly. I assume the 4:30 showing." Zoli nodded. "That's right." The woman manipulated the odd-looking machine in front of her. "That would be $8.95, ma'am." She handed over a bill which said $10 on it and got back some change along with a little piece of paper which looked like her ticket. She followed the directions on the signs, handed the ticket over to a clerk, and found herself in a room filled with people. Presumably, they also wanted to learn more about the country's independence. There was a big white screen at the front of the room. Were they going to be displaying images from the country's founding on that screen? Was that a curtain which was hiding a stage behind it filled with actors? She'd find out soon enough, she supposed. She saw that the people next to her were drinking an odd, fizzy brown drink and were eating something called popcorn. This must be an American celebratory custom, she thought. She headed over to the front desk again and bought some of these two products. The popcorn tasted pretty good. The drink, however, tasted awful, and it burned going down her throat. How could Muggles drink this? Were their digestive systems different from those of wizards? That would be a useful thing to know. The screen eventually lit up and showed previews of various shows. Most of them seemed to have a lot of violence and death in them, and one of them had a scantily clad woman in it. She frowned. Wouldn't that encourage young people to behave violently? Why did the Americans do that? Did it have something to do with the Independence Day celebration? Finally, the lights dimmed and the main feature began. Much to her surprise, the story about Independence Day was going to be shown on the screen. As well, she had managed to convince herself that there were actors hiding behind it, which had needed some extra time to get ready. The opening scene showed a picture of something which looked like the American flag against a starlit sky. There was virtually nothing in the foreground, just an area with a lot of holes in the ground. Someone was talking about exploration, something about taking one small step for man. Presumably, this was discussing how the American nation had been founded. The movie went on, and the wind started blowing and started moving around the flag. The scene widened slightly and showed a large Muggle vehicle heading towards something which she recognized as the planet Earth. Most fascinating, she thought. Apparently, the Americans' ancestors came from outer space. Did Muggles originate from outer space? Is that why they had trouble casting spells? That Muggle vehicle looked huge, she thought. There could be lots and lots of Muggles in it, she thought. For all she knew, the entire founding population of the United States could have arrived in that vehicle. She brought out her quick quotes quill. This would be most educational, she thought. Chapter 345. It wasn't Russell and Bird after all. Wednesday, September 4, 1996, Dublin, Ireland. Next up. The new gold standard Brogan Lenan was talking down the street, marveling at all of the Muggle stores. He thought it was hilarious that they needed wheeled vehicles to travel all over the place and knew nothing about Quidditch. By his very nature, he had been unable to interact much with Muggles prior to the fall of the Statute of Secrecy. Now, of course, everything had changed. He couldn't understand why Muggles needed all these things. Who would want to play chess on boards where the pieces didn't move? Why would some need more than one television set if they couldn't even show 3D images? It boggled the mind. Brogan Lenan had been about to give up on this street when a sign in the display window of Robert's pawn shop caught his eye. We buy gold, pound 350, 00/Rs. Brogan Lenan stopped in his tracks as a plan began to take shape in his mind. He was a prankster, like most of his kind. This would be the ideal place to try a practical joke, and if everything went as planned, he'd get really rich. However, he had to think this through. He couldn't just walk in there without giving the game away. After all, he was only 6 inches tall and would very easily be overlooked by the tall humans behind the counter. Blimey, it was possible that people would step on him, an extremely embarrassing way to go. Brogan Lenan shrugged. He was a smart leprechaun, and he knew he'd figure something out. Robert O'Malley returned from his bathroom break to find another envelope in the mailbox. Wondering how much he would have to shell out this time, he opened it and nearly fell over in astonishment. The envelope was filled with old gold coins. He didn't recognize the people or nationalities, but he suspected they were Roman. He pitied the poor soul who would be willing part with his antique coin set in order to pay the rent in this economy. However, he had to admit that reselling these coins at £400 per ounce would get him a lot of money. He examined the coins critically and was soon convinced they were genuine. He then carried them over to the scale and determined that they weighed 17.4 ounces in total. Bloody hell, over £1 of gold. If he could sell the coins to gold buyers, he'd make a fortune. There was a piece of paper inside the envelope. Frowning, O'Malley unfolded it and read it. Dear Mr. O'Malley, it pains my heart to do this, But I am going to have to start parting with my set of gold coins from the era of Diocletian. I need to put food on the table, and I have run out of all other options. I intend to repurchase these coins after I become solvent again. In the meantime, take care of them for me. I have heard rumors that gold sellers have been stealing gold coins and ingots from their stores to try to resell them at these high prices, and I don't want you to fall victim to the same trap. Keep an eye on these coins and place them securely in your vault. If any of them disappear, please talk to your employees and see where they went. I'm willing to pay an extra £50 ounce in insurance. If they disappear, I want their value repaid in full at the standard £350 ounce. Please send the check to Brogan Lannan, 35 Mayfield Drive, Dublin. It has been a pleasure doing business with you. Sincerely, Brogan Lannan. O'Malley wrote out a check for £5,220 and put the coins in the vault. These coins weren't going anywhere. No way. He'd heard of unscrupulous people working in pawn shops, but he'd been in business for many years and had weeded out all the bad apples. If this Brogan Lannan was willing to part with £50 ours because he didn't trust the dealers, tough luck for him South Boston. Red Auerbach couldn't believe the old fellow was still alive. Then again, leprechauns were strange creatures. For all he knew, they were immortal. He had first Lorcan Iaflaith back in 1957 while he was managing the Boston Celtics. The meeting had been more or less accidental and had nearly been a disaster when he barely had missed stepping on the little guy. Lorcan had confirmed that he was in fact a leprechaun who was currently living in South Boston. Lorcan had then pleaded with Auerbach to give him a place to live somewhere else because he was being harassed by some gangs in the area. Eventually, the two men made a deal. Auerbach would allow Lorcan to live in the Boston Garden rafters in exchange for Lorcan not obliviating him. As it turned out, having a leprechaun in the building had been beneficial in more ways than one. The Celtics' luck had improved greatly over the next few years, and the team had won 8 championships in a row. Unfortunately, by the late 60s, rumors began circulating about a leprechaun in the building, and Auerbach had been forced to kick Lorcan out. The Celtics fell apart soon after Lorcan left. For a long time, Auerbach refused to bring Lorcan back for the simple reason that A, it wasn't sportsmanlike, and B, other teams deserved a chance to win from time to time. Unfortunately, Auerbach had found Lorcan banging on his door with a bloody nose in March 1979, pleading for asylum. Against his better judgment, Auerbach let Lorcan back in from time to time, allowing him to spend half his time at the garden and the other half in South Boston. By the time the mess in South Boston had cleaned itself up in the mid-80s, the Celtics had won a few more championships, and Auerbach was having second thoughts about having the leprechaun in the building. Lorcan left after 1985, and the Celtics returned to mediocrity. The leprechaun's beard had gotten a little grey, but Lorcan was still sharp as a tack. He listened as Auerbach proposed his deal. Now that the statute of secrecy had fallen, Lorcan could become the team's official mascot and fly around in the Fleet Center during basketball games. He would get paid in galleons and could live there in perpetuity. In exchange, Lorcan would refuse to improve the Celtics' luck or cause the opponents to have bad luck. Lorcan didn't like the idea of refusing to provide people with good luck. However, he acknowledged that he was out of a job and money would be quite useful at this point. The negotiations took less than half an hour, and when it was over, Lorcan Iaflaith was once again an employee of the Boston Celtics Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Professor Flitwick couldn't deny it anymore. Although he had tried to keep everything under wraps, the results of his Ziggurat Labs test had leaked out. The results had included Q, Z, and B. The B had been the big surprise. It was goblin DNA. He soon found himself standing at the podium, explaining that he was 1/8 goblin. He just hoped that the school would react favorably to this. Thankfully, for the most part, they did. A few Slytherins scowled at him and called him derogatory names, but they tended to do that to everyone. Chapter 346, The New Gold Standard. Wednesday, September 4, 1996, International Monetary Fund Headquarters. Greece. Next up. Werewolf on trial. Anastasios Dialynis had heard of strange things before coming out of the Muggle world. However, this took the cake. He looked at the Economist in disbelief. You want some of the Muggle nations to start accepting galleons? The Economist shook his head. More than that, Ambassador. We want the galleon to become the world's new gold standard, with all Muggle currencies eventually backed by the galleon. Dialynis shook his head. How is that possible? We don't have enough galleons to cover situations where large numbers of Muggles try to turn their paper currency into gold. You don't need to worry about that, Ambassador. First, very few people will actually want to be using galleons. Besides, I've heard you have a lot of gold and that it's difficult to counterfeit. You'd be surprised how much that's worth in Muggle currency. Dialynis threw his hands up. But we still don't have that much gold to make galleons out of. I mean, last time I heard, we had maybe 1 billion kilograms in the international vaults. The Economist chuckled. That's a lot of gold, Ambassador. $550 ours is $8,800 pound, or about $20,000 kilo. You're sitting on $20 trillion, my magical friend. That's a lot of money. I still don't get how this is going to help you, sir. There seems to be less volatility in the wizarding economies than in the Muggle economies, so the galleon is pretty stable. Second, from what you've told me, wizards all over the world use galleons regardless of which country they're in. If there is anything better suited for an international currency, I don't know of it. There are plans in the works to try to give most of the countries in Europe a common unit of currency called the euro, but no one knows if that will actually work. Dialynis disagreed. There's definitely volatility, sir. You've only been aware of our existence for less than a year, after all. If anything, the first interaction with the Muggle world could cause some dangerous fluctuations in prices as Muggles try to buy magical equipment. The Economist began pacing around the room. I see your point. What do we need to look out for most of the time? International wizarding wars aren't that much of an issue, especially worldwide ones, as we figured out many years ago that the ability to cast spells tends to lead to mutually assured destruction. Countries do fight from time to time, but the wars rarely spread. Let's all pray that the chaos in Houyhnhemland doesn't spread any further. Was Judgment Day an international wizarding war? No, Sir Judgment Day was basically a scaled-up version of a typical wizarding situation where a dark wizard emerges and tries to take over his or her local area. I'd say a good 60–70% of wizarding confrontations are like that. Had the Statute of Secrecy not fallen and Voldemort not been given access to Muggle technology, I doubt the scenario would have gotten past DEFCON 4. Voldemort would have likely been a local nuisance to the British Isles, and that's that. Now that we know what to look for, we can try to stop these situations before they get too far along. Dialynis smiled. Put it this way. Voldemort did something very similar to this in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Many people were killed, and the British wizarding community was thrown into turmoil, and you didn't hear about it. What about the other 2 Judgment Days? Dialynis shrugged. One was a comet impact, as you know. The other was back in the 1600s BC when a dark wizard tried a primitive form of biowarfare against his enemies, and it spread into the Muggle world. In retrospect, that should not have been considered a Judgment Day, because the people in the Americas would not have succumbed to the disease. However, you have to realize that back in those days people still thought the world was flat, and all of the major civilizations known to the ancients were in the Fertile Crescent, Egypt, India, and China. If a plague takes out the Fertile Crescent and is on the verge of making it into India, you've got problems. The wizards of the time had no idea that they were overestimating the chances of the end of civilization. The economist whistled. Sounds like the Black Death. Dialynis nodded. Indeed, the situation was very similar to the Black Death, which got to DEFCON 1, but no further. Had the Norse explorers not discovered evidence of distant lands in what would now be called the New World that could have reached Judgment Day as well? Was there a dark wizard involved with the Black Death as well? Dialynis hesitated for a moment before responding. He knew things had to be kept classified here. We're not sure, sir. There are many Muggle legends from that time which discuss sorcerers, but there's no way to tell if they're related to the Black Death. What I can tell you, however, is that Flamel was inspired to work on the Philosopher's Stone by the Black Death. He was still in his 1st century at the time, not as knowledgeable and wise as he is now, but still a formidable force. At any rate, back to the subject at hand. The chaos involving the Black Death caused people to start hoarding and faking galleons in the 14th century, and the value of a galleon depreciated greatly by almost 10,000. Thankfully, volatility like that is extremely rare. There's been nothing like that since. The galleon's been very reliable over the last couple of centuries. The economist winced as Dialynis continued. If you do switch over to using the galleon as your monetary standard, I'd recommend 2 things. First, wait until 2001, or so, a good 21st century advance, for all of the repercussions of the falling of the Statute of Secrecy to sort themselves out. And second, give us time to start producing galleons made out of something other than gold. Now that the Statute of Secrecy has fallen, that has to be one of our primary concerns. The economist blinked. You're going to stop using gold. Why? Dialynis chuckled. A galleon is worth about £5 right now, thanks to the Black Death depreciation. From a Muggle perspective, its value as bullion is greater than its face value. If Muggles start melting them down, we've got problems. What we need to do is make galleons out of something which is much less valuable than its face value, maybe lead with gold leaf. The traditionalists won't like it, but I don't see how we have much of a choice here. We won't need to worry about Muggles duplicating them because of our special spells. The economist got up. That's good to know. I'll keep you posted on the proceedings. So far, this is all theoretical. Whether we will actually do it or not depends on the opinions of the Muggles. The United States and other powerful countries probably won't like it all that much, and they've got veto power in the UN and so forth. It's probably going to be a long, hard fight. But in my opinion, it's one that's probably worth it. Kirkukarek, Mahmoud Singh chuckled. The pompous dictator of Iraq had no idea that the wizards who were seeking asylum in his nation had included all 7 Indian Death Eaters who had survived Judgment Day. Singh didn't have enough to take over the government yet and turn it into another Death Eater state. Voldemort had been a far more powerful leader than he, Singh, could have possibly been. He had told everyone to wait until they had at least 200 members before proceeding with the coup. Voldemort may have been dead, but that didn't mean that there were no people left who were convinced that wizards were superior to Muggles. Singh couldn't imagine how someone could not think that. Wizards could cast spells and use technology if trained. Muggles could only use technology. Who was supposed to rule whom here? On the surface, all of the Death Eaters had agreed to serve as philanthropists and benefactors, similar to what Lucius Malfoy had done. They had been welcomed by Saddam personally, those who had not actually had the dark mark branded on their arms, of course. The others had to stay hidden, because a dark mark would have been an obvious sign. There had been only one case where some Iraqi Muggles had figured out something was wrong. The Death Eater in the area, due to the grace of Allah, had been a master obliviator, and had managed to deal with it without resorting to murder or anything else which could have ruined his reputation. The 7 Death Eaters had been joined by 15 other freedom fighters who had been too nervous to come out when Voldemort had returned. That was 22 partisans. A good start, but there was still more work to be done. He needed to find a source of wizards who thought they were superior to Muggles and were itching to get back at the Muggle world. Fortunately, such a place was not so hard to find. It may have been reformed on the surface thanks to Muggle technology, but he was sure that there were still citizens who preferred the old ways. You couldn't shout at equipment and use machines as scapegoats and punching bags if you were stressed, after all. Grinning, he placed the map of Círdan in his pocket and made his way to the new Círdani embassy to apparate over there. Círdan fit perfectly. They didn't like the United States. They believed wizards were superior to Muggles, and they were pagans who needed conversion to Islam. What could possibly go wrong? To be continued. Merpeople Trading Outpost Noto Island, Ishikawa Prefecture, Japan. The days of the Five Fins Merchieftainess, Asmera, were busy since the events of the first week of August. She had to reassert her dominance over the renegade elements of her tribe, who came back to her after the demise of the demon. No, Merwizard Sabers. Luckily, they could solve that conflict with minimal bloodshed. The abomination's personal guard was neutralized by non-lethal magic before bullets and blades would have been needed, and the rest of his tribe saw reason and surrendered after a warning shot from a Muggle submarine's torpedo launcher. A lucky thing, as it later turned out, their weapons were enchanted well enough to possibly pose a threat even to the submarines. On the other hand, the death of the tattooed wizard would have been more than sufficient to kill 5 others, and proved to be very memorable in its own nauseating way. This memory has driven her to make some hard decisions. She allowed the Trapanandans to take away as many members of the defeated tribe as they pleased, and they were off with 7 of Cerbas's dozen children before the blood stopped oozing from his scattered remains. Their withdrawal was hasty and probably without immediate obliviations. Judging by what they learned, this would not stay so for long. As the pieces began falling together, a sense of dread settled over her. Apparently, a group of powerful wizards of her species had at least one hidden base unknown to anyone, including the mighty Atlantis of the humans. Also, the knowledge that there were no wizards born to merpeople was a lie, and these mages have spirited these children away and obliviated the tribes. Her own memories of having some imaginary friend for years were suspicious. Very likely residual memories from obliviation, explained away by her mind. Those bastards took my friend away. For some reason, they didn't do that in Roctorattle, and this way Merwizards appeared there from time to time, ending up as secret superweapons in the power struggles between factions, or causing accidents by not receiving proper training, or just living normal lives in blissful ignorance. Her suspicions were confirmed by the eldest, but the old merman asked her to keep it secret for now, as Trapananda is too powerful to attract its wrath. On the other hand, there was nothing wrong in finding a way to passively fend off these supernatural stalkers, and the Roctorattle leader gave some clues about that. What did Roctorattle have that they lacked? The answer was simple: wizards. A month has passed, and none of her tribe was obliviated, as far as they could tell, as ever since they were in the company of Roctorattly and Japanese wizards. Also, as far as she could guess, the Merwizards chose to stay in isolation because they saw the rest of their kind as primitive and too much a danger to their precious pure blood. Screw them, hypocrite scum, for sticking with that lame excuse. They could have stayed with us to build an advanced society together, just telling people that they had to keep wizard bloodlines pure. But no, they had to go hide from the rest of the world, don't giving a sh*t about our problems, she thought. This will teach them. Trading outposts opening all around the world. Wizards and muggles of all race invited to visit the tribes or even live among them after all. Every city wanted at least a healer. It provided employment for wizards, health care for merpeople, and by having a wizard in town, scared the Trapanandans away. Win-win-win. She smirked when she remembered another detail. Unlike her, the Japanese mages could not be convinced so easily to keep the secret. They only promised to keep it classified, but that still meant sharing it with the Grand Mugwump after their investigation is closed. Any day now, and Dagger said I will unleash a big can of butthurt on that selfish scum. Surely the wizards can find a way to contact them and demand a drastic change in their policies. Or if not, she could go to the Muggles. Learning more about airbreather politics, she found groups for humans quite sympathetic. Of course, the name would have to go they weren't human. But they were Muggles, and suffering for it. Her musings were interrupted by the doorbell and the yelling. Merchieftainess, your guest will arrive in 5 minutes. She remembered her schedule. A meeting with a strange Muggle was about to start. The meeting will take place in one of the recently finished Rattle-styled underwater buildings near the shore, with a flooded basement and an air-bubbled first floor. She was in her own apartment, a couple of buildings away. Preparing for the meeting and many others to follow, a surprising amount of Muggles was interested in her people's products and abilities. So far, the Nodo Island outpost, shared by a dozen tribes normally living near the shores of Honshu, grew into a small amphibious town over the course of a month, complete with docks and an airport on the land. Relations between the tribes were surprisingly amiable in light of their past clashes. But then again, there was plenty for all to take. The Japanese were interested in everything they had, from edible aquatic plants to exotic fish they caught, and minerals and magical ingredients they gathered from the sea. And their services, too. The marine divisions of the human police and defense force were eager to employ merpeople, not to mention the dozens of them finding diving guide or coast guard jobs, or contracts for surveying rivers and lakes, or recovering submerged goods. Today's guest, Naboru Kamitani, wanted something else. At first, she thought it's a prank, but thinking it over, the man's idea of a mermaid chorus performing to human audiences was more genius than mad. Checking her new human wristwatch, she grabbed her slate from the table and swam out of the house, thanking her tribesmen at the door for checking in on her, then approached the meeting hall. Going for the top floor courtesy dictated that she allowed the human guests to speak, while she wrote down her part of the dialogue. Entering the airlock, she found 2 humans in the comfortably furnitured room waiting for her. They looked somewhat familiar. 250 miles north of Syktyvkar Republic Russian Federation. Sebastian Orlov swatted another loud, fat, and ugly horsefly away. Summer in Siberia was apparently just as bad as winter, only with mud and lots of insects instead of deadly cold. Volunteering for this mission was decidedly a bad idea, but it seemed easy at the time. Their dear leader Rasputin had stashed away a few things back in his day near his birthplace Pokrovskoy and around it. Their job was to go and check on some of those, following his instructions. Unfortunately, some stupid bloke half the world away thought it'd be a good idea to smash a powerful magical artifact into pieces, and consequently, blessed the entire world with a month of rainfall. May the 1,000 vanguard spirits of Chernobyl feast on the whining shards of that fool's soul. Their group was 8 men strong, and led by a mage, a young witch named Safia. Having learnt a bit about wizards, Sebastian didn't really understand why Rasputin had to delegate the task to them. He was a wizard, able to teleport anywhere at will, and as he placed this treasure himself, he should have no trouble picturing the place. Of course, the mad monk didn't give them an explanation. Well, maybe to the witch, but she didn't tell them either, thinking her pretty little self above them a pity. She was quite the looker, and not above some flirting with him. Perhaps it's just a test of faith, he thought. Rasputin will just apparate over there to see if we really did check on his stuff. And he'd punish us if we reported him that it was just not there, probably eaten by a wolverine, like his last 2 worthless pile of letters and books should have been. Seriously, sending them to check on letters and have the witch copy them. So far their only use was when they had to solve some riddles to get the hidden treasure, and any novice of the cult with half a brain could have answered those questions. And here they were, marching through this mud-soaked wilderness, the roads hopelessly flooded, and even the frightened, superstitious locals shouting strange things at them, telling to stay away. As if he didn't want to do it anyway. And now the sun was going down. As short as the summer night was this far up north, it still meant stopping and setting up camp. The witch pointed at the next hilltop, showing where their tents will stand. Taking a look at the setting sun, Sebastian stopped as he spotted a silhouette standing about 50 meters away. A voice reached them, crystal clear and audible despite the distance, the words flowing like the water of the purest mountain spring despite the funny accent. "Well, well, what have we here?" The rest of the group turned there as one and stared with gaping mouths at the approaching woman. She was without doubt a woman. She was the most feminine being the cultist has ever seen. It shined from every particle of her being, promising him untold pleasure, but also threatening agonizing pain. There was no greater torture than withholding that pleasure. And suddenly, an ugly, screeching, grunting voice dared to distract him. "Look away from her, fools," said Safia, pointing her wand at the beauty. "She's a Rusalka," she improvised, knowing that the two are pretty much the same, with the latter being the more fearsome and malevolent aspects of the nice folk distilled into Muggle myths. If convincing the men that this creature charming them into brainless puppets was an undead revenant seeking to lure them into an undignified death was not enough, she was in deep trouble. The Vila spoke again, and the witch swore as the men glanced back at her and stayed that way, hopelessly mesmerized. Worse, the bitch was calling her men, calling them to herself, and calling them hers. Gritting her teeth, she opened her mouth to cast a curse at the insolent slut, just paralyze her, shut her up, letting the brainlessly horny idiots give her more than she bargained for. But she never got there. All of a sudden, she felt the impact of a curse at her back, and she fell forward into oblivion. Already moving towards the girl, Sebastian didn't even notice the dull thump of his leader's body hitting the muddy ground. Pretty soon, they stood in a loose half-circle in front of the beauty, who swept her seductive gaze over them and said in her most charming voice, "Oh my, so many men for a single girl. How come you're not fighting for me?" At her words, adrenaline burnt through the cultists' veins, and all 8 of them were at each other's throats before she could even finish the sentence. After a minute of chaotic free-for-all with fists and knives and guns, and even a clumsily wielded rifle, Sebastian shot the last bastard who dared to set his filthy eyes on his mistress, and stood panting with a nasty stab wound in his feet, barely registering, despite the knife still nailing him to the ground. As he tried to limp toward his delightful prize, the girl laughed mockingly, a noise like glass shattering, and he faintly heard a plain female voice behind him saying, "Stupefy." A second later, something hit him in the back and knocked him forward. He was unconscious before he hit the ground. Chapter 347, Werewolf on Trial. Thursday, September 5, 1996, Amsterdam, Holland, Netherlands. Harrison Cooper stood at the defendant's podium as the cameras flashed around him. The judge had only allowed Muggle cameras in the courtroom as the smoke emitted by the wizarding ones tended to set off the sprinklers in the ceiling. That didn't prevent the wizarding reporters from flooding into the room, either as patronesses or in person with quills. There was a veritable who's who of wizarding notables in the room. The British Minister of Magic, Nicholas Flamel, had flown in for the first part of the trial. Neil Schumann, the Dutch Minister of Magic, had come as well. A few people from Atlantis were in attendance as well. Both ministers were planning to take the stand in Cooper's defense. Severus Snape, the genius behind the wolfsbane pill, would have come as well, but he had been forced to decline because he had to teach at Hogwarts. Harrison had also been told that there would also be testimony from another werewolf, a man who simply identified himself as Lugnag. When Harrison asked Schumann who he was, all Schumann could say was that he was a werewolf. He suspected, however, that there was something more to this. He could have sworn that he had heard the name Lugnag before, but he couldn't remember where. For some reason, English class came to mind. He looked over at the plaintiff's podium, where he actually recognized many of the people from the cruise. Many of the plaintiffs were elderly, and he shuddered at the thought that his werewolf jaws could have killed people that frail. One man in a wheelchair, had nearly clobbered him with a cane as he came into the courtroom. He was facing 4 pairs of involuntary manslaughter animal attack charges and no fewer than 11 civil suits for monetary compensation for the plaintiff's emotional and physical distress as a lycanthrope. His lawyers had told him that they'd likely merge everything into a class action lawsuit. Although that made it more likely that he would escape unscathed, it also raised the harrowing possibility that he'd be convicted of everything and be in really big trouble. The Dutch government had provided no fewer than 7 interpreters. 2/3 of the plaintiffs didn't speak Dutch, and Harrison couldn't understand a word. What's more, the jury had trouble understanding English. Supposedly, Minister Schumann had sent someone to the Ministry of Magic in Rotterdam to see if she could get her hands on some language lozenges. Harrison watched as someone walked to the front of the room and barked something in Dutch. The interpreter translated, "Attention, please. All rise for Judge Radar laughs." Everyone stood as a balding man with a mustache entered the room and sat down behind the judge's platform. One of the clerks brought a folder filled with photographs and other evidence to the front of the room, and the judge thanked him and opened it. "This is case 1353, Cooper vs. Michelson, et al. Are the defendants and plaintiffs both present." Both sides said they were there. "Good. Now if you would, please stand and swear an oath that you will tell the truth throughout these proceedings. You may choose to swear on a Bible or do so as an unbreakable vow." Not surprisingly, both parties chose the Bible. Harrison wasn't particularly fond of turning himself into mincemeat because he accidentally spoke a lie. It took 5 minutes or so to swear everyone in. Once that was done, Judge Alafs told the plaintiffs to make their introductory statement. Harrison winced as someone with a big bite mark on his arm took the stand. Displays like that could easily move the jury. Someone had clearly done his homework. The plaintiff began to speak. "Your Honor, my name is Brian Michelson. I was on the MS Nordham on the night of June 1st, 1996. I was listening to a concert in the Top Deck's cocktail lounge when this man transformed into a rabid wolf and bit me. The bite infected me with the condition as well, and I have been transforming into a wolf every full moon since then. I'm seeking $50,000 USD per year in compensation for the physical and emotional trauma associated with being a werewolf. That's over $500,000 a year if it's a class action case," he thought. "There's no way I'd be able to pay that." The judge wrote down some notes and turned to Cooper. "Mr. Cooper, how do you plead to this charge?" Harrison spoke without hesitation. "Not guilty, Your Honor." It wasn't really a lie, after all. The nasty wolf part of him did the biting, not Harrison himself. If anyone was guilty, it was that fellow who had bitten him in the first place at the football stadium. The plaintiff nodded to the judge and sat down as another man took his place. "Your Honor, I'm Alan Malley from Cincinnati, Ohio. My wife and I were on the boat as well when the defendant attacked us. He bit my wife first and then went after me when I tried to get him off of her. I survived unscathed, but my wife didn't. She died a few days later. I'm asking for a charge of involuntary manslaughter." The judge turned back to Harrison. "How do you plead to this charge, Mr. Cooper?" "Not guilty, Your Honor. I would never do such a thing." The judge jotted down some more notes. "Your pleas have been noted, Mr. Cooper. Mr. Michelson, would you please begin presenting your case? How exactly can someone involuntarily bite someone and rampage through the ship?" Harrison could answer that easily. People in wereform have no sense of self and have no knowledge as to what they're doing. Mother Teresa would have done the same thing had she been afflicted with this condition, though to be honest, I wouldn't wish it on anyone. The judge called him off. "You'll get your chance to defend yourself later, Mr. Cooper. Right now, we'll listen to Mr. Michelson's case." Harrison listened as Michelson began going into detail as to what happened on the boat. He wondered whether he should start talking to his lawyers about an insanity defense Dublin. Robert O'Malley stared at the newspaper in amazement. They had finally finished counting the votes in North Korea, and the people had chosen to rejoin the South. A man named Park Wan-min had been given the office of interim president, and he would be in charge of North Korea until reunification was complete. It had taken almost half a century to resolve the crisis in the Koreas, but resolved it had been. American troops left in the Koreas would be coming home soon, and the first division of the Wizard Standing Army was going to be sent home to Sweden or wherever it had come from. The last vestiges of Kim Jong-il's despotic regime were finally beginning to be erased. Elated, O'Malley walked into his office to check on the goods he was pawning. As usual, he walked into the vault to make sure everything was there. Everything looked fine, until he saw the envelope from that Brogan fellow which had arrived chock-full with gold coins. The envelope was empty. The coins were gone. Horrified, he searched the room frantically for the missing coins. He couldn't find them, however. Telling some customers to hold on for a few minutes, he spent another half-hour rummaging through the vault. Nothing. He couldn't believe it. Someone must have seen the gold coins on the way in, broken into the vault during the night, and stolen the coins. At first, he couldn't imagine why they hadn't stolen anything else. Then it occurred to him that the coins were small and could easily be hidden in a pocket. Some of the other items in the vault were too large to escape with easily. Hoping his fear wasn't visible on his face, he made a mental note to get a video camera for inside the vault and check to see if the security camera above the store had caught anyone entering during the night. It had to be one of his employees, he realized. Who else knew the code to the vault? He resolved to watch his employees closely until he got a chance to look at the security cameras. If anyone called in sick or was acting strangely, well, then he'd know. That Brogan fellow had warned him about possible bad apples in the pawn shop business, and O'Malley hadn't taken the threat seriously enough. He needed to do something to allay his new customers' fears. Verdelius Safe House Russian Federation, somewhere north of the Arctic Circle. The doors in the side of the small mound opened, revealing a descending tunnel illuminated by the cold glow of bottled blueball flames hanging from the walls. A slender woman with flowing black hair and revealing pure white clothing led a group of 7 withered walking corpses, carrying 2 bound and gagged prisoners on their wiry shoulders in. Lastly came a witch of completely average build, with short-cropped brunette hair and plain but practical green-gray clothing. She turned to look at their tracks in the mud, frowned, then uttered a few spells to make the footprints disappear and reappear in random places. Closing the vault doors behind herself, the witch then followed the inferi down the tunnel and kept casting tergia on their muddy footprints and finally at the legs of the undead. I can understand they can be quite useful, having the brute force you squib weaklings lack, but would it really be too much to express some gratitude by ordered your pets to use the doormat? She snarked at the Vila leading the group. The seductress blushed in shame and said nothing. Obviously, you haven't commanded this kind of underling before, continued the lecture, and apparently watching the rest of your clan doing so only got you so far. I'm sure you were told before, but I'll tell you again. These guys are mindless. They do what I order them to do, and as our rights dictate, I ordered them to follow your orders, and they will do just that. Nothing more, nothing less. And don't get your expectations up. They can't be taught any useful skills. The Vila blurted out a quick question. Can't they shoot Muggle weapons? The witch huffed dismissively, but gave it same thought. Well, you could, but you'll have to order them to every required motion. That sounds slow and impractical in battle, doesn't it? The novice Inferius controller's eyes lit up with an eerie gleam. Oh, but I can give them definitions for composite orders. My sisters do that sometimes. I can lead my troops just as well as they do theirs, and better. Just wait and see, Sabine. I'll be the best controller these lands have ever seen, and our Queen Mab will honor me for it. Just be careful not to draw too much of her attention, came the dry remark from Sabine the witch. It is known that young, beautiful, and skilled ladies tend to be taken to her court and never to come back. Which ladies? Quipped the Vila and pointed at herself. Squib, here. I ain't gonna disappear. Speaking of which, now that you got those two captives, shouldn't you be taking the long flight over the pole to the Queen with them? She might be interested in a group of Muggles led by a witch, wandering in her territory, and this means a personal interrogation, not just a relay by two-way mirror. Just take care not to disappear yourself, she jested. Not gonna happen, said Sabine. I'm no beauty, the blondie I've caught. Okay, we have caught, I'll mention it to her, isn't half bad. And while I don't intend to disappear, a promotion to somewhere better would be great. If she likes this gift, who knows, perhaps she'll give me a new position in Chicago. Chapter 348, New Vision in Space Exploration. Friday, September 6, 1996, Kennedy Space Center, Cape Canaveral, Florida, United States of America. Bill Clinton flinched as the world went white momentarily, and he was nearly deafened by a monstrous clap of thunder. He looked around the room to see if there had been any damage. The chairman of NASA chuckled and shook his head. Everything's fine, Mr. President. I saw the bolt as it came in. It hit the lightning rod on top of launch platform 39A. Don't worry, the tower's all right. We'll still be able to launch space shuttles. Clinton looked back at him archly. If we're still going to be launching space shuttles, judging from what you've told me about Linda Warren's invention, I suspect those huge behemoths are going to become outdated rather quickly. The chairman nodded. I wouldn't be surprised, Mr. President. Clinton nodded pointedly at the documents in his hand. Do you think these deadlines are feasible once we get out of the economic recession? It would be a stretch, Mr. President. However, if we were able to do it for Kennedy, we'll be able to do it for you, assuming you don't cut our budget too much. Clinton shrugged. We'll have to cut something, Chairman. However, remember you've got magic at your beck and call now. You can do things without building expensive machines now. How's that Portkey to Mars doing? According to Linda, it's still heading outbound. ADA at Mars is expected to be between 9:18 and 9:21. It should get back to Earth between 10:07 and 10:12. We're working on a Venus sample return now, as well as a manned moon mission. Boeing has been extremely helpful with this, sir. One of the reporters coughed delicately and looked at his watch. Mr. President, I hate to break up the festivities, but it's getting close to air time. I'd recommend that we finish getting set up for the announcement. Clinton nodded, loaded the final copy of the speech into the teleprompter, and positioned himself so that the audience would see the banks of computers and monitors behind him. He had wanted to have the shuttle's launch facility in the background, but the thunderstorms in the area had forced him to scrap that plan. Announcing a new initiative in space travel when launch complexes were being bombarded with lightning bolts wasn't a particularly good idea. The cameras focused on him and the reporter counted down. When he hit 0, the red lights flashed on the cameras and the reporter pointed at him. Clinton looked into the camera and began reciting his speech. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I hope that you are well and that you are weathering this economic storm as well as you can. Rest assured that your government is doing everything possible to get the country back on a solid financial footing again. I have reason to believe that the economy has hit bottom and may turn around soon. People are slowly beginning to recover from the loss of the New York, London, and Miami markets, and are realizing that the world may have overreacted to the events of Judgment Day. Sales are starting to pick up again, and the stock market is up 5% over the past week. Rest assured, my fellow Americans, prosperity will return to our fair land. In the meantime, it is incumbent upon me to help create new jobs and give our nation a goal to strive for. This is why I have come here to Kennedy Space Center. I am here to announce a bold new space exploration initiative which will provide hundreds of new jobs and take advantage of our new liaisons with wizards. You may recall recent reports that a witch in North Carolina was able to send a Portkey to the moon and have it return with moon rocks. This indeed happened, and the rocks are being studied as we speak. She has spent the time since then improving on these portkeys, speeding them up and making them more robust. There is a portkey en route to Mars as we speak, expected to return to Earth with Mars rocks sometime around Columbus Day. Yes, that is a 6-week round trip. One must keep in mind, however, that Mars is much further away than the Moon. Furthermore, plans are in the works for a Venus sample return mission, as well as for a manned Moon mission. Clinton smiled into the camera. Yes, that is correct. A manned Moon mission, far more sophisticated than anything in the days of Apollo. Thanks to generous support of the employees of Boeing and Secretary of Magic Ariadne, the Selene is planning to be launched with a crew of 4 to a location on the Sea of Tranquility. Climbing into the capsule will be Linda Warren, geologist Jean Dumas from Wichita, Kansas, Chinese astronaut Li Chin H. Sing, and Russian cosmonaut Grigory Markovic. Manned moon missions cannot help but give people of my generation thoughts of John F. Kennedy and his challenge to put a man on the moon by the end of the 1960s. Space exploration may have plateaued since then, but due to the untapped power of magic, I believe it is time for my administration to issue its own challenge. I call upon the American people to spearhead a program which will reach the following 10 milestones. Had it not been for the economic recession, I would have expected these to have been accomplished even earlier than this. 1. Launch a manned mission to Mars by 2006. Yes, that is by the end of the decade starting today. 2. Create a one-stage reusable manned spacecraft by 2008. 3. Construct a space elevator by 2010. 4. Build a space station capable of supporting 100 humans by 2015. 5. Create a permanent moon base by 2020. 6. Create a permanent Mars base by 2030. 7. Construct bases in the asteroid belt and on Mercury by 2035, which will allow for mining of extraterrestrial resources not found on the surface of the Moon or Mars. 8. Construct a manned station orbiting Venus by 2040. 9. Send manned missions to Europa and Titan by 2050. And finally, 10. Begin terraforming the Moon by 2075 to provide more space and relief for our polluted and overcrowded Earth. Clinton looked at the camera. There we have it, my fellow Americans. A challenge to inspire us and future generations. Once the recession ends, and I am confident that it will, the combination of magic and technology will allow us to boldly go where no one has gone before. Chapter 349. High Holiday Preparations. Saturday, September 7, 1996, Main Hallunga Instituter Heimbeck, United States of America Kennedy Space Center next up. Amazon. Comes John Paul Roman II looked around the room where Samuel was leading Saturday morning services. At first glance, it would have passed for any other Jewish service. However, there were several subtle differences. The Shema, the traditional Jewish declaration of faith, had been done silently as to allow every single worshipper to recite whichever declaration of faith suited them best. The cabinet which held the Torah scrolls had space to include several other religious texts, such as books from the New Testament and the Quran. The traditional Torah reading had been accompanied by excerpts from the other monotheistic texts and from the Buddhist sutras. Finally, the Amida, the most important Jewish prayer, had been replaced with silent standing meditation. The services were still separated by gender, as they had been the case since the beginning. However, it was fairly obvious that women were starting to make inroads into the proceedings. Deborah, inspired by the Christian and Jewish laywomen, had stopped wearing her veil and had taken it upon herself to lead the women's services. For the first time in millennia, men were allowed to see her face. John Paul had to admit that had it not been for some missing teeth, she was not that unattractive for the age she was killed at. The Pope chuckled when he recalled the first time Deborah had taken off her veil. He had been with Samuel and Tickwell at the time, and he remembered vividly the two ancient men staring at each other and rolling their eyes. The expression on their faces was priceless and obvious. There she goes again, and it's not my fault. It was now widely accepted that John Paul Roman II was the only pope who mattered anymore. The original rationale for the Celestine movement had been abruptly negated when Celestine himself had returned to the fold. Although there was still an organization called the Celestine Church, it was increasingly obvious that it was slowly transforming itself into a quasi-religious order dedicated to the persecution of wizards. Several people had taken to calling it Christians for humans, something John Paul resented bitterly. No true Christian would do what the new Celestine branch was proposing. The man who had declared himself Urban Roman 9 had conveniently disappeared just about the time the first rumors about Christians for humans had emerged. The Pope watched as various participants carried Torah scrolls, Qurans, and a Buddhist text around the room. Several people walked behind them in what appeared to be walking meditation. The texts were returned to the ark. A final prayer was recited. This is a tree of life for those who adhere to it. And the door to the ark was closed. Everyone then sat down to listen to the sermon. Samuel and the interpreter walked up to the podium to deliver the speech, and the Pope could tell that this was going to be important. Samuel seemed resolute, and the interpreter seemed nervous. Several of the congregants began talking quietly to each other, and the Pope eventually made out two words, Rosh Hashanah. The Pope nearly fell over as realization hit him. This was indeed going to be big, and it would likely be controversial. Samuel began to speak. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to take this opportunity to discuss the upcoming high holy days of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. As you are all undoubtedly aware, Rosh Hashanah starts a week from last night, and Yom Kippur is September 23rd. Judging by the reaction of the crowd, Samuel had in fact caught several of the people off guard, particularly some of the more conservative Muslims. Some of the Hindus had looked around the room in confusion. The 10 days between Rosh Hashanah, the Abrahamic New Year, and Yom Kippur are intended to be devoted to contemplation and introspection, where people review their conduct over the previous year and resolve to improve their actions. When I was alive, the high priest would blow a ram's horn to encourage people to wake up spiritually and psychologically, so they can put themselves in a position to meditate on what they have done. The introspection period begins on Rosh Hashanah and concludes on Yom Kippur, which is designed to be a full-scale one-day ascetic meditation retreat for secular and religious people alike. Worshippers are expected to impoverish their souls through fasting and other ascetic renunciation practices on that day and accept responsibility for their mistakes over the past year. Only by learning from past experiences and admitting one's failures can a person grow. John Paul nodded. This seemed more or less consistent with what he knew about this season. It hadn't occurred to him that the Hebrew text anatom et nafshokum could mean anything other than fasting. However, if one simply looked at the text, it literally said, impoverish your spirit souls. That sure sounded like renunciation practiced to him. Although some of the people around him were grumbling that they weren't accustomed to fasting, that didn't seem anything particularly controversial. Samuel continued his speech. As you may or may not be aware, the priests have special ceremonies to perform at the temple on Rosh Hashanah. In addition, the high priest has an extremely important one to perform on Yom Kippur. Because of this requirement, I am asking every single man here who is an ordained priest to go to the temple in Jerusalem next week to minister to the faithful and perform these rites. This includes Tikwel, who was a priest, and I, who was the son of High Priest Eli. This practice has been performed for many centuries, and it would be remiss of us to stop doing so at this point, especially since the world needs guidance after an extremely tumultuous year. We will be in Israel for the 2 days of Rosh Hashanah and the 1 day of Yom Kippur. John Paul's jaw dropped, and he wasn't alone. What was that supposed to mean? Was he going to start sacrificing animals in the temple again like they did in Samuel's day? He sure hoped not, as doing so would likely be a serious desecration of the venerable Islamic shrine. who was supposed to be running the show here when everyone else was out in Jerusalem. He turned to look at the Cohen Gadol, who had realized what he was going to be asked to do. He looked at the Pope and whispered quietly in John Paul's ear. "Has he gone nuts? We can't sacrifice animals in there without offending many Muslims. Although I am more than willing to do something to provide guidance for our flocks, I'm not doing that." The Pope spoke urgently in Suleiman's ear. "I suspect Samuel has a trick up his sleeve. He isn't stupid. Let's hear what he has to say." Samuel continued, "People who are not ordained priests are welcome to either come to Israel with us or stay here, where the Dalai Lama will be running the conference in my absence. He will lead Rosh Hashanah services. Anatil will stay behind, as well in case you need assistance from someone from my era." John Paul shook his head in disbelief. He liked the Dalai Lama and believed he was a great leader, but shouldn't a monotheist be leading the conference in Samuel's absence, let alone running Rosh Hashanah services? And who was going to rule on arcane Abrahamic laws in Samuel's absence? Deborah. The Pope winced when it dawned on him that this could be a setup for disaster. Deborah was already gaining a big following among the women. Without Samuel and possibly Tickwell to keep Deborah in check, she'd probably start ordaining a few female priests and rabbis as the most senior member of the group left in New York. Although the Pope was starting to understand why female priests were feasible, Jesus did have female disciples. After all, he doubted everyone was as progressive as he was, and he was reluctant to start ordaining female priests lest it split the church. Again. The Pope glanced into the women's section and caught a glimpse of Deborah. She had a sly expression on her face. It was obvious that the implications of Samuel's absence hadn't been lost on her. Samuel continued, "Once Yom Kippur ends, there will be a few more days here in New York before the rest of us join the priests on the pilgrimages for Sukkot, the harvest festival when we celebrate our bounty." Judging from the reaction of the crowd, Samuel could have just introduced a festival for John Wilkes Booth instead of a festival for Booths in general. He understood the theory, of course. Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot were the three Jewish pilgrimage festivals, holidays in which every able-bodied Jew was traditionally required to make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. It hadn't occurred to him that Samuel was actually going to expect everyone to go to Jerusalem. The Pope frantically looked back over the past year. Samuel had already been in Israel for Passover, and he probably thought everyone would come, and was surprised when they hadn't. He had been on hiatus over Shavuot, which had been in the late spring, so he hadn't had a chance to discuss this issue. Now, however, John Paul shuddered. Did Samuel seriously expect a few billion Abrahamics to pile into the temple? And he had thought that the Hajj was crowded. This was going to be complicated. National Air and Space Museum. Linda Warren led the 4 astronauts into the Selene, a former Apollo command module which had been kept in storage at the National Air and Space Museum. Making sure that the module was filled with argon before she cast the spell, she cast the charm on the module, which gave it extendatent properties. This would allow the crew to move around freely without constantly bumping into each other. And it would also allow them to consume less oxygen, which would be important for a trip like this. For this first trip, they had chosen a location on the Sea of Tranquility, a few hundred miles away from the Apollo 11 landing site, near the edge of the basin. The goals of this mission would be to see if the melt rock varied across Mare Tranquillitatis, the site, and to return rocks from the edge of the mare. Each astronaut had been provided a spacesuit for Eva, which they would be wearing at the start of each leg of the mission, just in case there was a problem. The bottom of the capsule had also been padded with foam to cushion the travelers in case there were high G's on takeoff. Judging from the experiments with the animals and her own experiences with Portkeys, the G's shouldn't be a problem. However, it didn't hurt to be cautious, especially when there was no one around to help you if you were injured. Making sure everyone was strapped in, she activated the final 30-second timer. Since the spacecraft itself was the Portkey, it was imperative that the astronauts be in physical contact with it all the time lest they fall off en route. As a result, each person was wearing a long strap around one ankle which was tied to the side of the vehicle, yet allowed the passengers to roam around freely. The countdown hit 0, and with a lurch, the Selene launched itself into the air on the first manned moon mission in a quarter century. Chapter 350, Amazon Dart comes. Sunday, September 8, 1996, Nestorian Embassy Cape Verde next up. It isn't easy being green. 5. Plinio Raoul Henriques couldn't believe it. Against all odds, he'd been one of the lucky few to actually win a chance to visit Nestor with the first group of Muggle tourists. He was 23 and in very good health, and his friends were telling him that he should go after every woman he could get his hands on. He soon discovered that, in addition to the large numbers of single men who had been chosen to go on this expedition, there would be a large number of anthropologists. Not surprisingly, every single one of the anthropologists was female. There were supposedly two very good reasons for this. First, scientists had to remain objective and not allow themselves to be distracted by Vila glamour. Second, there were rumors that Nestorian society was heavily matriarchal, where women tended to be in positions of power more often than men. It occurred to him that if he didn't wind up picking up a Vila girl, he could always hit it off with one of the scientists. They probably spoke Portuguese, at least. He looked around the room where the visitors were going to meet the Nestorian ambassador. As far as he could tell, there were no married men in the entire expedition. He supposed that it made sense, given that married men may want to cheat on their wives. He would have had no way to know, of course, that the entire purpose of his visit would be to increase the Vila gene pool. 3 of the men next to him were placing bets on who would sleep with the most women. Henriques could not help but chuckle. Considering that they would only be there for a couple of weeks, he highly doubted that they would be able to conquer that many women in that time. Besides, Henriques was totally convinced that the Vila would go after him. Heads turned as the travelers heard footsteps in the front of the room. Henriques saw an old man, presumably the Cape Verdean Minister of Magic, walk into the room. Somewhat disappointed, he was about to turn his attention back to the grandiose plans of his colleagues when a woman walked in and the Minister of Magic closed his eyes. Henriques's jaw dropped when he saw that she was the most beautiful woman he had seen in his entire life. Every single man turned to stare at her, and some of them began inching closer to try to talk to her. He discovered, with some embarrassment and alarm, that the lower parts of his body were about as interested in her as his eyes. The woman had wavy blonde hair flowing down her back and blue eyes that he could drown himself in. She looked like she could have put supermodels to shame, and she seemed to have muscles to match her figure. Her complexion was marred only by a small beauty mark or tattoo on her forehead in the shape of a star. She looked at the crowd with a combination of interest and amusement. Finally, she shook her head and closed her eyes for a moment. Henriques suddenly found his interest in the woman fading somewhat, dropping from goddess level to Cindy Crawford level. The Minister of Magic opened his eyes and turned to face the Muggles. "Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to introduce the Nestorian ambassador to Cape Verde, Dorothy Astora. She has been maintained stable public relations with me, our nation for the past 4 years. She received her doctorate in political science in June 1960. Someone cut in, "This woman's 60. The minister rolled his eyes. "Yes, she is. If you think she's attractive, wait until you see the 20 and 30-somethings. At any rate, she has a doctorate from the University of Amuzana, one of the most important cities on Nestor. She, like most educated Nestorians, is fluent in Portuguese, Spanish, Nestorian, and an obscure dialect of English called Gulliver." Henriques gasped at the name, and he wasn't alone. The minister smiled at that. "Ah, I see you recognize the name. Yes, the Muggle myth of the island of the Amazons comes from stories of Nestor. The same is true for the goddess Venus. who was named after the powerful Nestorian Queen Wynidra, who reigned in the late 3rd century BC. After all, if most of the people look like Dr. Storer over here, what else would you expect? Storer looked like she wanted to kick him, but she restrained herself. Instead, she looked over the travelers and nodded. All right, here's how things are going to work. Since we're on Nestorian soil right now, it's going to be possible to apparate and Portkey from here directly to Nestor. We're going to start by dropping off some of the anthropologists in Nestora, the capital, where they're going to get a chance to talk to some of the politicians and meet with some of the local population. Since real sociological research has to come out of their visit, we've made a restriction that only female researchers will be able to participate in the program. The men, however, will be traveling to the city of Eurasia, where they are going to be entertained to the best of our ability. Henriques hooted at that. Was this what he thought it was? The ambassador looked over the crowd, hard. Yes, ladies and gentlemen. Part of the reason we've opened up is to expand the gene pool, which has gotten a bit inbred over the past few centuries. Since there aren't any full male Vela, our species is primarily female. As a result, we need assistance in order to keep ourselves going. The crowd hooted even louder. What was this, spring break? Risa from Star Trek. Come to think of it, the city's name was Eurasia. Since men tend to have trouble operating around us because of our ability to charm them, there are explicit rules regarding sexuality on Nestor. Sexual displays and come-ons are strictly forbidden 10 months of the year, with the exception of between members of married couples. This allows the government to actually function most of the time. Each town has a 2-month period where, shall we say, everyone is allowed to run wild if they so choose. We call it mating season, and for good reason. It just so happens that Eurasia happens to be in the middle of this season right now, so that's where the men are going to be going. In theory, once you get over there, you're going to probably be picked up by no fewer than 5 women at the same time. I'd recommend waiting for them to come to you, not the other way around. If you try to go after a woman who doesn't feel like playing at the time, she might get angry. And when Vela get angry, we sometimes turn into these. Stora closed her eyes for a second. There was a brief flash of light, and when it had cleared, she had transformed into a hideous bird maybe 6 feet tall with a half-human face, wings the color of blood, human hands under the wings with something which looked disturbingly like balls of fire in them, and claws 6 inches long. There was a loud shriek as the men, Henriques included, retreated towards the back of the room. Henriques noticed that his private parts were retreating as well. Ouch. Having made her point, she changed back to her normal form and chuckled. Those claws can be very good at disemboweling people and tearing off men's private parts. Needless to say, you do not want to hit on a Vela who isn't interested in you. The men looked at her warily. Henriques couldn't believe it, but was he actually having second thoughts? She pointed at the little star on her forehead. This is how you figure out if a woman is interested in you. If she wants to fool around, she'll have a little mark painted on her forehead like this. If she's actually at the time of the month when she can have children, she'll have 2 marks. If you do end up fathering children, we'll tell you and you'll get visitation rights. Rest assured that we'll take good care of them. If they don't have marks on their foreheads, stay away unless you want to lose body parts. The Minister of Magic looked around the room and frowned. Turning to the Vela, he said, Dr. Storer, may I recommend that we head over to the island now before the men here lose their interest. And next time, please don't turn hoppy on them. The Vela looked at him like he was nuts. You want them to go over there thinking that they can screw whomever they want. No, Dr. Storer. Just tell them the rules and don't demonstrate the hoppy form. That will be enough, at least for now. She thought for a moment and nodded. Turning back to the prospective tourists, she reached into her blouse, half the men craned to look, and pulled out a long piece of rope. She unrolled it and tossed it to the floor. All right, anthropologists. I want all of you to grab onto this rope and not to let go until I say so. It's a Portkey, and it will send you to Nestora, where President Markali and the welcoming party will greet you. The landing's a bit bumpy, so brace yourself." Henriques watched as the anthropologists reached out for the rope. Seconds later, they disappeared along with Stora. Several men groaned. About 15 minutes later, a flash of light announced Stora's return to the room. Unrolling the rope again, she turned to face the crowd. "Ladies, you're next. We're going to be sending you to Eurasia's town square so you can talk to the people." The ladies grabbed onto the rope and disappeared. 15 minutes after that, Stora returned. She looked hungry. "All right, gentlemen, your turn. Everyone hang on tight." Henriques grabbed onto the rope. He heard a brief slap followed by the rope, "You idiot. Not me, at least yet." Soon, Henriques was flying through the air over what appeared to be an ocean. About 8 minutes later, he found himself falling onto what appeared to be a beach drenched in sunlight. Getting up, he saw that he was on what appeared to be a tropical beach. Palm leaves danced in the breeze as waves lapped against the shore. There were several bungalows in sight, and he hoped his guess as to what they were for was right. He didn't need to wait long. Seconds after their arrival, the doors of the bungalows opened, and a woman with a mark on her forehead emerged from each little house. Amazingly, they were even more attractive than the ambassador. They were wearing very revealing robes, and it didn't take long for him to realize what they wanted. He couldn't help but think, "Monster or no monster, I'll take them." One of the women approached him as he heard Stora's voice a few feet away. "All right, let's head over to that bungalow. Then you can grab onto me." Meanwhile, Henrique's suitor looked him over and nodded. "You'll do. What's your name, sweetie?" Henriques could barely talk. "Plinio Raoul Henriques. Ah, what's yours?" "Gabrielle Iandora. You ready for some fun?" Henriques grinned ear to ear. "Hell yes. I haven't been able to find a girlfriend in over 2 years. Where's Xena?" She looked at him in confusion. "Who? I don't think I've ever met her. You mean to tell me you've been here before and met someone? How?" Henriques winced. Muggle television had a show with powerful women named Gabrielle and Xena working together to fight off monsters and stuff. I thought it would have been based on Nestor, given what I heard about Muggle myths. Gabrielle laughed. "Fighting off monsters, I can't help you with. However, I'm fairly certain I'll be able to help you with something else." As a matter of fact, she was able to do so. O'Malley's pawn shop and Robert O'Malley tried to calm down his outraged employee. "I'm sorry, Seamus, but I don't know what to think. I know I didn't take the coins, and whoever did it had access to the vault." Seamus swore. "There have been more valuable things than gold coins in that vault, Bob. I haven't taken any of them, and you know it. If you want, you can call in a wizard, and I'll swear it under oath." O'Malley's mind raced. Seamus had a point, he said. There were more valuable things than gold in there, including expensive heirlooms. If someone had gone through all the trouble to break into the vault, why would he only take the contents of the envelope? Come to think of it, how would the thief have known that the envelope had gold in it to begin with? It had been sealed when he had first opened it and read Lonan's note. No one else had seen the coins outside the envelope. He had worked with Seamus long enough to know that the man wasn't lying. Seamus hadn't done it. Maybe Seamus could now help him track down the perpetrator. O'Malley headed for the security room and told Seamus to follow him. "This is ridiculous, Seamus. Maybe you can help me figure this out. I can tell now that you didn't do it and are as surprised as I am. Let's see what the video camera tells us from inside the office. At least we had that." The security officer says he'd have its data by this afternoon. Seamus nodded and followed him into one of the back rooms, where the security guard was staring at the screen in disbelief and horror. The guard turned to him as soon as he entered and pointed furiously at the screen. "You're not going to believe this, but I think we're going to have to call in a wizard." O'Malley blanched. "You think a wizard did this, not one of us?" The guard grunted. "Unless one of us has an 6-inch long pet capable of wearing humanoid costumes and carrying around envelopes, I'd say we're pretty much off the hook. Seamus winced. Wait a minute. Are you telling me that an animal did it? How would the animal be able to open the envelope? We don't know who opened the envelope, Seamus. However, we have footage from the time the envelope arrived in the store. Take a look at this recording and see if you see anything unusual about it. The three men crowded around the display as the security guard began the playback. At first, nothing happened. Then something which looked like a little green stick figure meandered into the empty room with the envelope in its hand. It flew up onto the table, yes. It flew and dropped the envelope on the desk. Then it jumped to the ground and walked away before anyone else could intercept it. O'Malley drew a deep breath. What the bloody hell was that? The guard rewound the recording and played it again, this time under slow motion. The strange figure flew onto the desk and dropped the envelope on the table. The guard then froze the image, zoomed in on it, and jabbed a finger at the screen, which was showing a clear shot of a person 6 inches tall wearing a green tunic. I'm not sure what it is. Bob, for all we know, it could be trained monkey or dog. However, what I can tell you that it sure matches the traditional descriptions a leprechaun. Seamus snorted. Leprechauns don't exist, Dan. The guard chuckled. Yes, and a year ago wizards didn't exist either. Coincidence? I think not. If I were you, I'd get in touch with the Minister of Magic and tell her that one of her underlings has been playing games with us. The secretary for the Irish Ministry of Magic had been about to hang up the telephone when the Muggle mentioned seeing a little green man bring in the envelope. Intrigued, she returned the headset to her ear and asked the Muggle to describe the creature. She recognized the being immediately and realized what had happened. Telling the Muggle that the ministry would look into it, she hung up the phone and briefed Miranda Delaney, the Minister of Magic, on the incident. The minister cursed under her breath. Are you telling me that you've got a leprechaun trying to sell gold to Muggles? The secretary nodded. It appears so, ma'am. This has all the hallmarks of a scam, particularly if the Muggles don't know that leprechaun gold tends to disappear. Delaney nodded. I agree, Maureen. Everything fits perfectly. The leprechaun brings in the envelope and provides a return address. The pawn shop owner writes out a check not knowing that the coins in the envelope weren't actually real gold. Remember that leprechaun gold will pass virtually all Muggle tests. The secretary winced. I think I see where this is going, ma'am. Indeed, Maureen. 24 hours later, the coins vanish and the owner immediately suspects someone's been raiding the vault. He suspects all his employees, who counter the accusation by saying that any sane thief would have stolen everything from the vault and not just the gold coins. That's the way I see it as well, ma'am. Even more interesting is that in this case, the leprechaun said he'd fork over £50 per ounce in insurance to make sure that he'll be repaid in case an employee steals the gold. Delaney whistled. That's very clever. We tend to forget that people that small can be intelligent. Instead of taking £350 per ounce, he accepts £300 per ounce knowing that he can get even more later when he comes to retrieve his gold. That's disturbing, ma'am. What are we going to do now? Delaney stood up and headed towards the door. I'll go down there myself. We need to nab this guy and warn the Muggles to pay careful attention to their gold. Let's just hope he doesn't give his friends ideas. Call them back and tell them we'll be en route. Oh, and see if you can get your hands on some Felix Felicis. We'll need it for this case. The secretary looked at Delaney, baffled. Felix Felicis, the luck potion. That's it, Maureen. As you probably know, leprechauns are famous for bringing people good luck. What people don't realize is that if you irritate them, they can give you bad luck. We can assume that this con artist is going to do everything he can to make sure we're either hit by cars or fall off our brooms en route. We'll need the Felix Felicis to counter that when we spring our trap. The secretary nodded and picked up the phone. Makes sense to me. I'll make the call now. Arctic Ocean. The frigid shores of northern Eurasia and America surrounded an expanse of water, known to the world as the Arctic Ocean. Thanks to the harsh weather, Muggles and mages alike chose to stay away from the region most of the time, and even the Inuit people have only probed its borders. Their tales of Ishigak fairies, shaman killer Kigatilic demons, the giant lupin Amarok, an orca wolf shapeshifter named Aklat, a great sea serpent named Tizharok, and the Aglulics, helpful spirits under the ice, have lured some curious wizarding explorers here over the centuries. They explored and catalogued the local fauna, and found that the Ishigak are the sentient fey version of fairies preferring to be left alone. The Amarok is identical to the Wahila XXXX. The sea serpent XXX is domesticated by the primitive and secluded local merpeople who themselves are the Aglulics. Aklat's XXXX and Kigatilic's XXXXX were indigenous, just like a few other, less prominent or dangerous creatures, and the masses of mundane polar bears, seals, and whales. Other than these few expeditions, human involvement was limited to the Inuit, and a few traders occasionally visiting them, and the only mages living in the area were their shamans. Other than those few who came there for secrecy, the frozen lands of the Arctic held many secrets, most of them forgotten by all. The permafrost of the local soil was seen as an ideal storage place for everything from surplus meat to enchanted ceremonial jewelry. Humans and other beings sometimes came here to hide themselves or others, but never to conquer. Somehow, no one ever did that in any meaningful way. Most people didn't even try. The land was barren and huge. No man could keep it in hand. And there were also the whispers of a great power up in the north, Mab, the fairy queen. Her name surfaced periodically for over a millennia, told in conflicting ways. Some said she was a small fairy, others said she was a human, or even a giant, prompting reasonable outsiders to assume she's just a mythical person. The people living in and near the Arctic Circle knew better, but kept their voices low in fear. Breaking from the glaciers of Greenland, icebergs floated in the white ice wasteland like islands. Some of them grew to colossal sizes, stretching over 100 meters above sea level. Muggles observed these white giants keenly, as they were very dangerous for passing ships, horribly demonstrated by the fate of the Titanic. But no matter how many sentry ships and satellites watched them, some icebergs were simply invisible to spying eyes. Icicle, Sidade, Arctic Ocean. Mab's seat of power was one such hidden iceberg, though the word utterly failed to describe the place. Frigid, monochrome, chillingly beautiful, mostly submerged Atlantis knockoff was much more fitting, though Sabine guessed the Ice Queen would remove her tongue if she dared to say this out loud. The massive block of ice was formed into a citadel by powerful magic, its sides going on for miles, and many hundreds of meters between the top of its many spires and the underwater bottom of the iceberg, itself carved full of cavities, some sealed, others flooded. Mab's powerful magic anchored or moved the citadel at her will, and also kept it from rolling over or melting. It also warmed the air inside, and somehow the ice itself, to provide comfortable living conditions to the residents and visitors. Deep in the bowels of the city, there was even a garden, planted in conjured dirt and bathed in magical light, complete with birds singing and flying around. The city was very sparsely populated at the first glance. Sure, there were tens of thousands of residents, but when most of them were 5-inch tall fairies, that wasn't such a large number. Then there were the merpeople of the Silver Walrus tribe, about 1,000 strong, but being stairs-hating beings, they mostly kept to the lower levels where they lived and deposited their catch of fish, squid, seal, and other sea life, which provided most of the mobile settlement's food. Other than them, a clan of Velas and a small tribe of giants who served Mab have occasionally been stationed there, along with the handmaidens of Mab, a small group of witches. Sabine had arrived here 3 days ago, after contacting her lady by two-way mirror. Mab had been very interested in the information she so far managed to legilimens from the captured pair of Chernobog cultists, and apparently the captured witch interested her in other ways too. Mab had her examine the prisoner's teeth and eyes, then even parade the imperiused girl naked before the mirror. The cultist, Safia, was a fine specimen, her body firm and perfect in ways only a very lucky 20-year-old could be. But the Ice Queen's fascination with the Russian blonde was odd for Sabine. It was not one beautiful woman's admiration of another, for Mab was a beauty too, with flawless white skin, silver hair and green eyes, if a bit more on the petite side than the well-endowed Safia. But Mab's gaze wasn't that of a horny lesbian or even a starved cannibal. It was the gaze of a pompous lady, eyeing a fine fur coat, and that sent the whole thing into the seriously messed-up category in Sabine's head. The brunette witch anxiously walked the endless, abandoned corridors of the White City. Since she arrived with the prisoners, they were locked away, and she was escorted to her quarters by a handmaiden. Her queen didn't speak of reward yet. She didn't say a single word to her. And now Mab requested her presence in the top room of the highest spire, above her throne room. That was the queen's private study, forbidden territory for even the handmaidens, no doubt a place of great magic. Climbing the stairs, she arrived at last to a silver door that opened noiselessly before her on its own. Walking in, Sabine surveyed the scene. Bookshelves lined the wall, as well as miscancelous items hastily shoved into alcoves. The room was vaguely circular, with intricate geometric patterns covering every inch of the floor in the middle. A dozen handmaidens stood on marked places in the floor, forming an ellipse, facing inwards, looking at the grimoires in their hands. In the middle of them stood two figures in the ellipse's focal points, dressed in white. Mab and the blonde cultist, the latter certainly against her own will. The brunette witch felt some pity for the girl, but also great curiosity. This ritual was like nothing she'd ever seen. At last, she'll be able to learn some really powerful magic from her employer. Mab looked at her and motioned her closer. Careful not to step on any runes, Sabine walked to the queen, who now gave her a vicious-looking ceremonial dagger and whispered instructions. On my mark, cut my wrist deeply, both of them, then walk over to the girl, force her to kneel with Imperio, cut her palms, and press them to the floor there, she pointed. Swallowing, and for a minute really contemplating a hasty escape, the witch nodded and took the knife. Mab motioned to the handmaidens, who began a chant. All around them, glyphs in the floor lit up with the color of magic, washed through each other in ripples, growing brighter and brighter. As they reached a crescendo, a barrier of some sort sprang up around them, and Mab said, "Now." Moving quickly, Sabine slid the knife deep through the queen's wrists, nicking both arteries, then, wand in the other hand, moved on to the girl. Safia looked like she's about to break whatever control she was under, so Sabine quickly cast the imperious curse at her, commanding her to kneel and put her hands in front of her as she did the cuts, then to press the bloody palms to the designated spot. Looking back, she saw blood flowing from Mab, filling a series of arcane runes on the floor and spreading towards them, and also Safia's blood spreading towards Mab in a similar manner. When the two flows met, they glowed with magic for a moment, then both participants slumped forward on the bloody floor, convulsing. The chanters fell silent, and the barrier dissipated. In front of their eyes, both bodies changed. Mab's hair darkened into grey, her skin became more wrinkled and speckled. Her eyes ceased to be striking emerald and became dull brown, then her body stilled. The only noise in the room was the wheezing of the blonde cultist, whose sun-kissed skin paled into the color of porcelain and honey-blonde hair became silvery white. At last she opened her eyes, now Mab's piercing emerald instead of Safia's sky blue, and snapped at Sabine. "You servant, heal my hands." Her voice was the Ice Queen's.